Well, kia ora and welcome to the programme. You're watching GREG, the Government Regulatory Practice Initiative based here in New Zealand. My name's Ian Kaplan, and GREG is hosted by the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, MB. And that's why, as I always do, I start with MB's opening karakia, and I do so now. Tawhia, Tomana, Gimo, Gimaya, Kahuri, Takuaru, Ki te pai kahurangi, Ke reira te oranga moku. Ma mahi tahi ka ora ka puawai. A mātou mahi katoa ka pono ka tika. Tihe mauri ora. Well, a very warm welcome to you. Now we're together, members of the audience. I can see you're still electronically filing in. GREG, for those of you who are new to us or new to these webinars, is one of the world's first networks across government for those who deal with state power. And I think because I haven't cracked this one for a few episodes, I don't mean electricity. Members of the audience, they don't get any better than that at all. We're in a conversation this month about international regulation. It's a biggie. It's a biggie for a lot of reasons. Now, just to say straight away, these conversations are really sort of multi-layered in the sense that they're there to kind of assist conversations that you might be having, or dare I say, provoke conversations that you haven't yet had but might wish to have, to sort of impart information, to provoke conversations of a similar kind. These webinars are live and also recorded, and in each case appear as, I think the notice that you will have consented to that brings you here with us today, and welcome, in the public domain. So if you're watching us live or recorded, wherever and whenever you are, it's always very much the case with these webinars that you're very welcome here. Today, as I say, is in fact episode 7 in this series, a conversation about international regulation. We all regulate in a global context. I think if you take anything away from this program, members of the audience, that's a killer point. We all regulate. No one is an island anymore. To the extent they ever were, no regulatory system is solely domestic. And I think the key point also that we're going to find today from no doubt conversations with you and conversations with our panelists is however diverse what and who and what we regulate is and are, we actually have a lot in common. But what does all that mean in practice? We'll take a look. It can be hard to see sometimes. I look back to a historical reference to the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer in 1987, which I think was signed about 3 or 4 years after Top Gun 1, Top Gun as it was. And if you're at my vintage, you'll remember Highway to the Danger Zone. I won't sing it to you, but I will, members of the audience, just point to the ambiguity, because of course that was very much a highway to the danger zone vis-a-vis the ozone layer, because regulators around the world were fighting to resolve the fact that more than 97% of ozone layer depleting substances were in play, and no pun intended, given the products that were involved, they were canned, thanks to a protocol between around about 50 jurisdictions. But it still might be, even despite that, less apparent. But as domestic regulators, we confront an international dimension every day, either directly or indirectly. So whether you think it's here or still something out there, this is very much the webinar for you. We've got a bit of a show and tell from our guests today, and also a show and tell in terms of the different sort of areas that people in government regulate and as a profession come together to discuss, and also the fact that we can come together with commonality as a profession to discuss international regulation as a sort of general topic, even though what we regulate, subject matter of our regulatory systems, is very, very different. Also, help is at hand to be announced, I won't say as an exclusive, but probably as a sneak preview in this webinar. One of our guests will be telling us about a publication that will be kind of a toolkit to help people in this area deal with international regulation and approach it. And so straight in with our guests, kia ora to Julie Nind, who is a Principal Policy Advisor, also in the Ministry of Business, Innovation, Employment in Trade and International, Matthew Keats, from my old shop, Inland Revenue. He's a Domain Principal at International Revenue Strategy. In a unscheduled, unadvertised, change-free advertised programme, we are, at least for the moment, without Jared Mullen, who is the Director of Digital Safety at the Department of Internal Affairs. But very happy to have the guests, Matthew and Julie, welcome with us. Now, before we jump in, it is very much a family show. Members of the audience, those of you who are with us regularly will know that this is a conversation with us all, and that you can contribute lots of ways. If you go to the bottom of the screen, for those of you who aren't familiar with Zoom, you'll see there's a Q&A function. Feel free at any point to log a comment, and we'll pick it up. And also the other thing is, feel free to vote on any of those at any time. So they'll whiz across the screen if your screen is configured to a voting view, so we can see just what you think about the questions in terms of what you'd like to be dealt with. So without further ado, members of the audience, let's crack into it. Julie, to you first, Kia ora, and very warm welcome. I guess, why cooperate?
Ian, I think there are probably 4 main reasons why people should be thinking about this idea of what I would call international regulatory cooperation. The first you've already touched on, things like the Montreal Protocol. There are some problems which are so global that no one country could ever solve it. So, I mean, I would also say COVID-19 is another example. You know, nobody's safe till everybody's safe.
Yes.
Climate change, obvious examples, but not everything has to be writ large on that kind of scale. It's also really useful and important to think about in terms of cross-border flows of goods or people or investment. You know, cross-border trade, you need to be thinking about how your regulatory settings interface with those of other countries. You know, you can understand if you're a small New Zealand, or not even necessarily a small New Zealand business, just a New Zealand business looking to trade overseas, if New Zealand's regulatory requirements are very different from trading partners, you may have to produce a version for New Zealand and a version to export. That's kind of not a very viable proposition. Likewise, we may restrict New Zealand consumers from, you know, receiving goods or services from overseas because it's just not worthwhile configuring something solely for a relatively small market like New Zealand. So that's a really obvious one. But the other one, which for me is actually incredibly important, and I think should be, you know, in the minds of all of us, is what I would call regulatory effectiveness. These days, so many of our regulatory systems, as you said, are not solely domestic. There will be an actor outside New Zealand or something that happens overseas that has an impact on how our regulatory system operates and can affect whether we can actually achieve the outcome we are wanting. So if we haven't thought about how we deal with that, because, you know, much as we might like to think, you know, as regulators, we're all powerful, we actually don't have much reach beyond domestic borders. So regulatory effectiveness is really important. Another thing which I think is sometimes also underplayed is the value of thinking about these things from a capability or capacity point of view. You know, if you're a small country like New Zealand, we don't always find it easy to attract the expertise that we might need to run some of the regulatory permission processes. So being able to tap into some expertise overseas is useful. And it's also really good for building trust and confidence between regulatory systems. So I guess those are what I would say are the reasons this is really important for everybody to be thinking about.
And thank you for that, Julie. And it's a massive, massive list. And I guess the other thing is, to the extent we ever tried to perhaps convince / delude ourselves that the international dimension was a nice to have, that's gone out the window now, hasn't it?
Oh, I mean, personally, as someone who's kind of worked in this area as a sort of a practitioner and now thinking about it, I think we should have been thinking about this 20, 30 years ago, but I would say that now it's you know, it's not an option. It should be part of our day-to-day work. It's core to that, and that's being recognised by organisations like the OECD, which has recently published some recommendations around this. So, you know, it's no longer a nice to have. It's critical to our role, for sure.
Thank you, Julie. Before we go to Matthew, I'd just invite you, members of the audience, to reflect on all that. Do you think it's a nice to have, or do you think it's something that's critical to your role? Depending, and I should have actually set up a poll about this, because it would be fascinating to see what you'd have had to say. If so, what's the reason for your answer in either case? And what would you need to persuade you to go to the other camp, or not, as the case may be? Let's take a look now at a practical regime where the international dimension is really firmly in operation. And Matthew, to you, and welcome to you. Just in your world, and also generally from your cross-government experience, what are the international regulatory cooperative structures on offer? And I appreciate that cooperative is just one dimension, of course, but what is it in the co-op game?
Thanks, Dan. Good morning, Ian, and good morning, everyone, too. Yes, it's an interesting question and a very interesting area as well. I do sort of come back to Julie's point around countries. We're no longer, I guess, islands, as it were. We're quite connected with the world around us. And if you think of something broad like international trade, you'd realize that quite a lot of New Zealand businesses and jobs are related to our ability to export and import goods in other countries. Regulatory systems, tax, for example, are often sort of designed or catered towards the local population. So we build our requirements around what domestic people typically need. But if you trade with another country, there's a need to try and meet their requirements as well. So you often need a bit of a bridge. And tax can perhaps provide some examples of that.
Let's take a look at that, because I know, just jumping in, and this is sort of making me homesick, as it were, for my previous job. I was involved in international tax and other product enforcement. So tell us about the nitty gritty, Matt. What sort of things have you done that you can obviously disclose to this audience that involve the international dimension? We know that we need international trade protection. We know that people with offshore isn't off limits, but in practice.
Sure thing. So let's think about the OECD. It's a great place to sort of meet and discuss issues with other tax authorities. There's something there called the Global Forum, which colleagues in my organisation are quite heavily involved in. It gives New Zealand a voice on the international stage. And it's a good way to sort of, I guess, bring problems that we see and find common solutions with our friends overseas. Aside from that, we also have a number of legal agreements and frameworks that sort of help people navigate issues that pop up when you're looking at tax between countries. And that can include things like double tax agreements, information exchange agreements, or collection agreements. And that's quite a useful tool to have. Try to think of those agreements as sort of building a bridge between the New Zealand tax system and the tax systems in countries that we trade with or have engagement with.
So the difficulty there, of course, with those sorts of regimes is what you're doing. For example, if you've got a double tax agreement, and I know from talking to Jared offline as well, when he was talking about digital extremism material, excuse me, the reliance that one has on other jurisdictions helping either under an international instrument or just mutual cooperation. How does it work with a double tax agreement where you're trying to collect tax debt? Somebody owes some tax in New Zealand, but they go to Germany. How's it work?
Yeah, very good question. And the answer, I'm afraid, is always a complicated one with tax, unfortunately. But if we sort of think about it in broad concepts, or sort of arrive at a point where if you did not have these types of agreements, and you were a small business, perhaps in New Zealand, and you were exporting goods into another country, in the absence of any of these agreements, you would probably end up, or at least more likely than not, paying the full amount of tax in both countries, both overseas and in New Zealand. So you sort of end up paying tax twice. That's not considered a particularly good outcome. It can be quite hard on the businesses involved. It becomes quite expensive, and it is sort of something that might put a bit of a handbrake on international trade, or otherwise dissuade businesses from thinking about exporting. And that's not necessarily a good thing for an economy. The way to sort of deal with this is to enter something like a double tax agreement, where countries will sit down bilaterally and sort of have a bit of a discussion around how to tax the trade or income or assets or flows of people or migration that occur between their countries. And often you can probably sort of see it like any other kind of sovereign right, the right to taxation. Countries will concede different points, or give, as it were, in order to receive sort of positions on the other side.
So it's I was going to interrupt, sorry, just Max, if you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, really, the sort of reciprocity argument.
Precisely. It works best when everyone sort of forms an agreement that's somewhere in the middle between where you are currently and where you would like to be. So it's sort of a give and take. And often with tax, instead of having to pay the full amount of tax in both countries, you'll either enter a position where you only pay tax in one country or the other, or you share the tax between the countries. So everyone sort of gets a little bit of the cake, as it were.
Yeah.
Not to be quite palatable, and it gives good certainty for the businesses that, I guess, traverse this path.
So I guess, thank you for that. And I mean, it is a complicated situation. If that's a situation where you're a regulator in New Zealand and you're basically trying to extend your regulatory powers offshore, overseas, and the normal message that would come back is, well, there's other sovereigns out there. Offshore is off limits. That's a way around it saying no. And then there's a different situation, isn't there, Julia? And you see a lot of this, I'm sure, in practice, where there's a sort of, if you like, an international parent regime. Like, for example, in a maritime situation where you've got international obligations that, say, maritime would have to comply with before anyone even sets sail, or other kind of parent international regime. How does that work?
Well, I guess there are things that a country or a regulator and a sort of regulatory system can do either on its own or bilaterally with another partner, as we've done a lot of things with Australia. You can also work in a small cluster, but there's some of the things like the maritime area it is a little bit akin to one of those kind of global problems, in the sense that the open seas are kind of not necessarily one country's domain. So what happens is that the rules that individual countries follow, I guess, are set by an international organisation in which all of these countries participate. And that's a really effective way where you need, I guess, a common approach, across pretty much everybody. And so I think the thing for what we need to remember domestically is that sometimes I have heard people say, oh, well, I'm not really interested in what's happening overseas in these organisations. We haven't got the money to go. It's a junket or whatever. The trouble is, though, that's where the rules of the game are determined. And so we need to know what's going on there, because we can't afford to be, an island that's different from everybody else in terms of our rules. And sometimes we might want to make the decision to engage when those rules are being set or updated, because we actually have some particular issues. Being a small, rather remote country, some of the rules might not favour us, and no one will think to represent a New Zealand view if we're not at the table. So yeah, a lot of international rulemaking, a lot of the rulemaking that influences us or should influence our systems is made in these international organisations.
And I think one thing that comes in, Julie, from that is a question of timing. So you've got these international regimes and not everybody is necessarily ready at the same time. And so you've got the reciprocity point, you've got the practical point. I mean, different jurisdictions, are going to have different takes on the maritime approach, or whether or not international, how much we regulate the internet in as much as we can. And so it's signing up to the book on timing. And so you've got these local clusters. Classic cases is trans-Tasman position. Do you want to sort of say something about that? I mean, I've been there practically in a professional capacity as a regulatory advisor looking to enforce across the ditch. What's going on in the background to make that normal?
I think Australia, the relationship between New Zealand and Australia around this stuff is actually relatively, I think, unique for two sovereign countries. I think on the back of our free trade agreement, which is called CER, and at the moment it's completely escaped me what the acronym actually, the Closer Economic Relations, that's right, that's what it stands for. Yeah. Which I think is regarded as one of the kind of most integrated free trade agreements in the world, and it dates back to the 80s. It's about to have its 40th anniversary next year, I believe. Yeah. So on the back of CER, we've done a lot of what I would call international regulatory cooperation arrangements with Australia. There's been a focus on creating what's been called a single economic market in the trans-Tasman. So sort of the idea that you could trade within Australia, operate in Australia or New Zealand, or vice versa, in a relatively frictionless way. And so we ended up negotiating a lot of instruments to support that. So one of the things which I worked on for, I would say, a good 10 years of my professional life was to put in place what's called the Trans-Tasman Proceedings Regime. And one of the key features of that, interestingly, from there's stuff which allows litigation between Australia and New Zealand to be civil litigation, just be like if you were suing somebody in your own country. But the thing which I think is interesting from a regulatory point of view is that it also allows things like regulatory sanctions, so long as they're monetary sanctions, to be enforced like an ordinary civil debt against someone in the other country. The idea around that is it's kind of expanding the regulatory reach of domestic regulators. And the idea is that we're actually both interested in the effective operation of our, I don't know, securities regulation, our consumer protection regimes or whatever. And we don't want people in Australia kind of doing dodgy things with New Zealanders and not being able to be subject to sanctions. So we've actually gone an awful long way with Australia, probably further than I think other countries, even the EU has done. Yeah.
And it is, and thank you for that, Julie, because I think members of the audience, how does this chime with you? You're trying to do some, I mean, it's tricky enough working across your own department. It's tricky enough working across your own government, you know, the New Zealand government. There's a complete Mardi Gras you could throw when you could actually do it across countries, or maybe it's normal to you. Let me hear from you. What do you say to all this? I know you're not shy, particularly if you are regular viewers. You're absolutely not backward and coming forward. What does all this mean? Is international guff? Is it practical? Now, someone's come back and said to us, well, of course, we now operate so much more globally, so an international approach stands to reason. But really, in your day-to-day, this is what I'm trying to explode here, because what I see around the traps is people saying, yes, we live in a globalized world. Yes, we've had the occasional enforcement offshore, or, you know, there's an international regime, but not necessarily perhaps, and you know, they've said to me offline, we don't really kind of embrace the international regime. It's somewhere other. It's somewhere out there. It's if I'm being mischievous, and I think it provokes a salient point, so I will be mischievous. It's the land of junkets in hotels overseas. What do you both want to say to that, or should I get under my desk?
That's an interesting one, isn't it? Yeah, I think it's one of those areas that does tend to sort of attract, I guess, attention for perhaps not always the best reasons.
Yeah.
How much of the airfares that a government department spends is quite a topical expense line. The kind of thing that can certainly attract attention. I think one of the things you have to sort of realize, though, is that sometimes these things are necessary, that you do have to be, I guess, at the table where these things are discussed, to have a voice to represent New Zealand. And that perhaps the benefits of that perhaps outweigh the cost of an economy flight to Europe, for example.
Yeah.
It's a hard one to sometimes quantify. Relationships are really important. And as most business people will tell you, it's good to do things in person, to sit down. As much as it is formality, it's an informal element too, the ability to have a general chat.
And relationships, Julie, really, when it comes to A, constructing a regime, B, maintaining a regime, and you will have seen this, I'm sure, across all the systems that you look at from your international regime. They're everything, aren't they?
Oh, I think relationships are the fundamental building block for all regulatory cooperation. I mean, we may end up touching later on the fact there are some things you can just do unilaterally, but I would say by and large, the relationships are the most important thing. I mean, to respond to the kind of, you know, the issue, as Matt said, you know, obviously traveling to an international meeting or to meet international counterparts is expensive. And I don't think that it means that this means you need to be going to every meeting or investing, you know, traveling every minute. It's about the very considered decision about when you should be doing that, realizing that not being there may be more disadvantageous to New Zealand than actually turning up occasionally. And if you don't go to, say, an international meeting for you that sets the rules for your area, you need to keep monitoring what's going on there, because you can't afford to be out of the loop. But even at a regulator to regulator level, I think you do need to have channels to communicate. I mean, you can do some of that on Zoom or whatever platform you like, but you do need to sometimes, I think, meet people to build that rapport, because it will make things so much easier when you want to ring them up to say, hey, I've got a bit of a problem here. Can we talk through how we could work this out? You know, you need to have those relationships with key regulators in other countries.
And I think it is being seen by the audience as critical. Thank you, members of the audience. I can see that you're thinking this through, and I can see that some of you are already coming back with some votes on questions. One comes back to us and says, our department's actually almost banned overseas travel and relies on virtual meetings, and we are losing our personal relationships and influence. how big a risk is that? And there's some voting coming through in support of that. So Matt and Julie, I think it sort of dovetails from what you've just been telling me. How big a risk is the lack of old-fashioned personal contact? Up go the votes. Thank you.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think it might well depend on the nature of the contact, as it were. Sometimes I do see sort of the benefits, I guess, that we all have from virtual meetings and sort of the typical Zoom webinars, such as this. It can be quite useful. It's not quite the same as being there in person. I do appreciate that. Some things perhaps can be done online, but other things are perhaps a little better suited to in person. And maybe there's sort of a question mark around sort of how do you draw the line between which ones you look to host online and which ones you look to participate in person. And it can be a little bit hard too, because sometimes it's hard to, I guess, quantify the outcome or the output from those meetings too. If I was to go to Europe to discuss tax matters, am I going to come back with a suitcase full of tax returns? Perhaps not. It's not as straightforward. But it is a risk, losing personal relationships, or I guess diminishing your standing or your influence within that field. But perhaps it's a risk that you can sort of look to try and measure and to try and balance. And that is perhaps a hard thing.
Yeah. I'm just thinking of you flying into Auckland, Matt, with a suitcase full of tax returns. And it's an interesting point, isn't it? Because if you were, and we've got the public purse, we have to think about all of that. But if you are looking at the value of the relationship in a quantifiable basis, if you've got somebody who is, somebody that you've caught up with at a professionally context meeting, and GREG is about connection, domestically and internationally, and I can see the votings going up on that proposition, then that connectivity actually probably has a monetary value that's worth a couple of crates of tax returns, in terms of reclaiming for the public purse. I guess just to pivot that question to you, Julie, it is an important one. It is a bit of an elephant in the room, the value and, the budgetary issues on canning in-person meetings, but the necessity of being together, both domestically and internationally. What do you say to that?
I wonder whether it would be helpful if people appreciated why this is necessary. I think that's the trouble, is I think people just don't see how critically important some of this engagement or being aware of the international developments in your area is. And maybe if that were more widely accepted and understood. And I don't think anybody's advocating that you just go to every, show in town or across the world. It's about a considered decision about when you should engage. But I guess understanding why you need to do this might be helpful. I mean, we're all conscious of budget constraints, and I think having myself, because I do a lot of international things, done all of it on Zoom and other platforms for the last 2.5 years, I've been able to do that up until now, basically on the strength of relationships I had already built. But because staff and other organizations or places move on, I'm at the point where I probably will need to go and meet with some people in person in the next while, but I don't think I will go and meet them, go to every meeting that's going. So I think it is about balance, and it's about demonstrating the why, and that it's a deliberate decision about when you go. It's not just we'll go every meeting just because we can.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can see the buzz in the chat. Thank you for that, Julie. That Fenona Tono is important critically, domestically, also internationally. There's an agreement in the chat with that, and an agreement with what you've both said. It can be difficult to quantify the benefit of travelling, but we always need to be justifying or clear that we can or can't justify the attendance, relationships, everything. And the other point, which we can arc back to, which is commented on in the Q&A, is that WTO rules actually require that we comply with international requirements in order to trade. So the connectivity ain't a nice to have, it's critical. Now, members of the audience, if you've just more recently joined us, you're watching GREG, the Government Regulatory Practice Initiative. This is a conversation about international regulation. We're over half time now. We have Matthew Keats and Julie Nind, respectively, from Inland Revenue and MB, who have wide international portfolios. What do you think about the dimension of international regulation? How does it work for you? Are you, like me, hopefully you're not. But if you were, you'd be reflecting on John Donne, the 15th century or 16th century English lawyer and poet, who said, and I sanitize it slightly, that no person is an island. Quite right. And again, there's a connectivity that goes there. Now, some people are going to be struggling in a sense and saying, well, yes, I get that international regulation applies to me. It's in my bailiwick, but what do I do? What are the practical rubber hit road tools that I can avail myself of in terms of capability? And I think, Julie, this is cue for what the closest we've had to a book launch, I think, if you want to tell us about something.
Yes, so I and colleagues in my team have been working for quite a long time, and we're getting near to the kind of, hopefully the launch point on what we're calling an international regulatory cooperation toolkit, which it had its genesis, as I said, you know, in the probably around 2000 to early 2010, you know, teens, there was a lot of work going on with Australia, and we learned a lot out of those processes. So there was actually a project to capture the lessons that we'd learned, and it resulted in a joint Australia-New Zealand document that was published by the Australian-New Zealand School of Government. And then what we've done is used what came out of that exercise to create what I would call a sort of this idea of a spectrum of cooperation options. So what the toolkit will do is explain a bit about international regulatory cooperation and then offer a range of different options so that you can think about the different ways you might be able to cooperate and whether those might be useful in the situation you find yourself. And then it's also populated with some case studies to illustrate that. Now, what I think is, what I hope will be useful is it gives people some ideas of, you know, what you could do, and it doesn't take you immediately, because I think people think that cooperation means you have to have the same rules as somebody else. So what I would call harmonization, but actually, I suppose I personally think that's like the dark side of regulatory cooperation, because it's actually quite difficult. You have to give up some of your policy sovereignty, I suppose, to be able to maintain that harmonization. And obviously, if you're talking about international organizations, that is how they tend to organize their rulemaking. You know, everyone has the same rules, and it's really a take it or leave it kind of deal. There's another kind of regulatory cooperation which is very common as well, and particularly around trade in goods, which is called mutual recognition, conformity assessment, mutual recognition arrangements. There are other kinds of mutual recognition which, say, New Zealand and Australia have done, which are a bit more interesting and innovative. But those, even those still require a bit of it. But there's actually a lot of soft stuff that you can do, which might actually be quite useful. So you could just exchange information with your counterpart in another country, which builds up that trust and confidence. You learn things, you might be able to share some work product. And then there's also things like enforcement cooperation, which is obviously really useful for regulators with regulatory reach. And the other thing, which I think New Zealand as a small country also does very well, is what I would call unilateral action. So that's things where, you know, what we sometimes might do is just say, look, we'll recognise and accept in New Zealand goods that meet the EU standards, the EU rules, the US rules, the Australian rules, you know, the China rules, whatever. And we, you know, don't play favourites. We just say, okay, we'll accept, you know, we have to be obviously satisfied that they've got robust systems, but we're not going to, you know, necessarily always develop our own. And so there's also stuff that we can do. So the idea of this toolkit is that you can look at all of these options and work out one which might be better or easier for you, and because it sets out some of the, I guess, the things that are useful about that option and some of the limitations, so that you can weigh those up.
So when does this document, what's it called, and when's it coming out? When can we get one?
It's called the International Regulatory Cooperation Toolkit.
Yep.
The exact timing is a little fluid, but I would say I'm hoping it'll be sometime in November.
Okay. So it's pretty imminent, and it's obviously in the public domain, and it'll be on the NB website, and we can mention it in members of the audience. We'll mention it in our forthcoming newsletters. Without giving the game away, there's quite a bit going on at the moment, and in terms of GRED products, but I'll do my usual plug towards the end of this webinar. Keep the questions and keep the comments coming in. There's just I suppose there's just a couple of things that I want to sort of move across to, and perhaps it's the war stories, and we have to be a bit careful about war stories, obviously, but subject to all the usual kind of professional caveats. Matt, have you got a war story that I guess points it up? If you were, if we were in the pub and we were talking about international regulatory cooperation, and you were on 10% commission for promoting it to me, and of course you couldn't as a public servant, but suppose you're allowed to, what would be the war story that would clinch it for you to say, look, it's real, it really works?
That is a tricky one, Ian. That really is. I think a lot of it kind of comes back to, if you turn the clock back maybe 10 or 20 years, the world was a different place. It was before the GFC. It was turn of the millennium, quite a lot of optimism, and things, I guess, were a bit simpler in those times. We often with tax, you do look at things that people set up years ago. It seemed like a good idea at the time, right? And sort of not uncommon for people to sort of try hide money overseas, as it were. It's one of those things. People do this for some reason. I've never quite understood it myself, but often the advice they receive says that it's fine or that it's otherwise okay. But it's never really sort of the full truth of things. It's years later, the stuff inevitably washes up on our desk. And as we start asking questions, as we start looking through things, you sort of start to realize that it was never as simple or as straightforward as it was made out to at the time. Dealt with many people who have, I guess, tried to hide their funds overseas, as it were, and have often on good advice by their accountants or their lawyers or their financial advisors. And then years later, they've ended up with some difficult letters from Inland Revenue, and it becomes hard for them to explain. And often they run into other problems as well. We talk about regulations, I guess, perhaps in relation to specific areas such as tax, finance, trade. But not all countries are equal. We all have regulatory settings at different levels.
Yeah,
and
that's the point.
You tend to find is that for countries that have low tax rates, they often also have very low rates of financial regulation and very low rates of consumer protection. So it's very easy to sort of set up an investment fund in a tax haven, as it were.
Yeah.
It also turns out it's very hard to get your money back if anything was to happen to it. And that often does catch people out. It's a bit of a shame to see, truth be told. Never really want to see a person parted with their funds. But I guess it's perhaps the risks that aren't always appreciated or understood. It is a shame when people do sort of take actions to try hide their money, as it were.
Yeah.
The outcomes are never particularly that good, truth be told. It's a lot of people have lost their livelihoods as a result of bad decisions that were made years ago on, I guess, poor quality advice or incomplete understanding. And that's a hard thing to see.
And it's recourse, isn't it? I mean, I think that's what you're saying is, the sale in the pub of the international regulatory cooperation is worth it because you get recourse in these situations to protect NZ Inc., to protect NZ citizens, regulated parties within NZ jurisdiction outside. And you point also, and one of our audiences just made this point in a sort of slightly different vein, and it goes to your point, Julie, as well, about overseas standards. Not all jurisdictions have the same benchmarks. Now, to you, Julie, on this one, the question here has been put, if you use and accept overseas standards, what recourse do you have if the verification of those overseas standards fail? So I guess you've got the platform, and in principle, the platform works, but the way in which it's dealt with and administered overseas isn't like what we do.
I mean, it kind of depends what sort of recognition it is. If it is, say, compliance with an overseas standard, generally those things, there's a kind of a well-developed process for testing for compliance with the relevant standards, and the bodies that do that have to be accredited in a particular way. So there is a sort of some assurance in the system. Sometimes you may in fact accept the importer or the supplier in New Zealand might have to just confirm that the goods comply. So if there is an issue, then they would be accountable for that. I guess you are expressing some confidence in the sort of processes that those other countries have in place. But I think we can, certainly for some, we have that level of assurance. We know that the EU is very robust. We know we're not going to say that they value keeping their people safe less than we do. And in fact, the thing which is really interesting, it'd just be good to throw out there, is with Australia, we have an arrangement which actually goes kind of beyond that, which says, actually, if you can legally sell a good in Australia, it can legally be sold here without having to comply with any other point of sale requirements. And the kind of underlying thinking there is, and this also applies to occupations where you have to be registered to carry out that occupation. If you've been registered in Australia, you're entitled to be registered here without having to go through more testing. The underlying premise is we think that Australia has a very similar risk appetite to us. You know, if you go to Australia, you don't worry if you have to go to the dentist that their dentist will be no good. You don't worry about drinking the water or eating the food. So actually, we'll accept that if it's okay for Australia, it'll be okay for us. And I guess that's a level of sophistication which perhaps we're able to have because we know Australia well, is quite similar to us. But we still know and understand that the EU and some of these other large blocks are good too. The other thing I would also say, that standards around goods, actually there's obligations in the WTO in any event that those should be based on international standards, which there's a process for developing them. And, you know, we actually are part of that process. So I don't think we're not taking some sort of, you know, risk here by doing this. It's a well-organized system that we're buying into.
And it's interesting, isn't it? It's a well-oiled machine, which is a little bit of a cheesy link from me for this brilliant question that's coming from the audience. We can all see it. And I think actually it really does re-question the apple cart. You know, all of this is based on the sovereignty of individual jurisdictions. And, you know, I take a haircut in my sovereignty if you take one in yours, so we can work together. But what transcends, I think this question is saying, what transcends the model of sovereignty beyond individual countries is big IT. The ability, and there's a vote, and I'm sure there'll be more where that came from, either telepathically or digitally. Big IT is becoming powerful beyond, I'll read this question in, the sovereignty of individual countries or the ability to regulate effectively. Now, I'll leave that point open because members of the audience, you may have a view on that, but there's also a degree of cooperation and collaboration. And you're looking at international tax, you're looking at Jared's world, who's not with us, but he would talk about digital harm. I guess looking at the future, and this is something, by the way, members of the audience, that you might be interested in, is a sort of theme that we're seeing right across the tracks, futurism, if I can call it that. What is the future of regulating in areas where big IT is a key driver or a stakeholder? Is kind of digital sovereignty, is digital stewardship? You're not shy, members of the audience. You jump in on the chat and tell me what you think or ask questions. But in the meantime, I'm going to go back to Julie and then to Matt. Big IT.
Yes, I mean, in a way, I think the issues are very similar, you know, as some of them that arise in the taxation area. You know, these organizations often have a presence in multiple countries, which suggests that, you know, and the fact that the internet, whilst it is, you know, things are kind of pinned to particular countries, you can be out of New Zealand and doing things that have an impact on New Zealand. This is the sort of digital harm type argument.
Yeah.
Actually what I was going to say is I think that pushes you to actually, if you want to be effective here, you need to work with other jurisdictions. And it may suggest that actually what you ultimately need is some sort of broad international instrument, and you obviously want to try to work with your regulated parties, but I think to effectively do this, it's not going to be able to be done just by, you know, New Zealand on its own or any other country really on its own. There are some blocks like the EU, to be honest. There's a thing called what's known in my kind of area called the Brussels effect. The EU regulates and it becomes effectively the international benchmark. If you think of the data protection right But I think that actually, aside from, say, a Brussels effect where the EU might do something, actually this requires more countries to work together to try to make sure that we have a way of imposing the kind of standards that we need to protect our people, and perhaps also to ensure that our systems and our businesses can operate in this global environment.
And thank you for that, Judy. It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I mean, I think, Matt, when we look at it from, you know, the areas that you've worked in, and I don't just limit this to tax, if you want to talk about others too, but, you know, the fiscal areas, and the idea that, yes, we're certainly borderless, but we're also borderless plus digital. And so it's not just borderless because of digital, in part, but actually perhaps more borderless, and with what that does. And then the plus digital, the big IT piece in terms of the big tax frauds, in terms of, you know, the big schemes, and in terms of the ability to transmit money, the ability to call other things money, cryptocurrency, other forms of less or unregulated tradable instruments. It's a minefield, isn't it? I mean, how do you approach regulating for future hypothetical states where we don't have a crystal ball, or at least not one that works terribly well?
Yeah, that is a very precise question. It's a challenge, isn't it? It's predicting what the future could be and then sort of building a framework around what you believe it would be. Do you think sort of building a framework would encourage that future to occur? Would it be supportive of it? Or if you were to build a framework and the future was to turn out differently, where would that leave you? Those are quite interesting questions. A good area to think about this would be looking at things like fintech, little financial IT startups that can sort of improve, I guess, the way banking or financial services are provided. Maybe a faster banking app or an easier way to make point of sale transactions. A lot of those companies typically don't have much in the way of regulatory frameworks around them because they're quite small. It starts as an idea, as a startup essentially, and there's a lot of risk and challenge with that, and it may become successful. And if it does become successful, it could become, I guess, what you call a unicorn, billion-dollar enterprise, a very large-scale piece of infrastructure.
Yeah.
And if it reaches that level, then it would probably fall under a regulatory umbrella somewhere that would have requirements then imposed on it. And often when you talk to these little fintech startups, and you can find them, there are a number of little incubators and other sort of forums. They're very interesting to watch. They're incredible people with incredible ideas, I have to say. A lot of them will sort of look to their regulators to give them a bit of a regulatory sandbox or a simple framework for them to kind of build their ideas around. And a lot of this is because those startups recognize that if you're going to be successful, you will be regulated at some point. And it's probably easier to bake those regulatory requirements into your business model at the start than it would be to sort of grow without it and then try and implement it at a later stage. You're sort of looking for a reasonable pathway. And those financial sort of fintech startup sandboxes, they can actually yield some pretty good results. I think Australia ran one through ASIC, and I believe there are a couple in America and the UK and Europe as they all sort of look to cultivate these environments. I think it's kind of recognizing that the future multinationals, I guess, of tomorrow or years down the track, they're all relatively young and relatively small now. And while they're young, they might need a bit of support or a bit of help growing. And maybe there's a regulatory benefit to assisting them at that stage or being part of their conversations.
It's an interesting one because I mean, just jumping in for me, Matt, what it triggers to me is actually from the last year's conference when we had a conversation about kind of, I suppose, international trend setting. And I think one of the guests there was saying that it's easy to romanticize international regulation because it is slightly other, it is slightly out there. If, for example, you're bringing in a massive international area of regulation, but also very profoundly domestic, undoubtedly climate change is going to touch local and central government in terms of the way it's administered under domestic New Zealand legislation, but also the international instruments, the international urges to stop it. How much of this international problem really, or the problems that we're looking to, is basically good old-fashioned common sense domestic regulation, all the things that we do in regulatory practice every day of the week, just applied to a slightly differently nuanced problem in some ways. I don't know, Julie, can we be overly romantic about this sort of thing?
I think that with all of these things, there's undoubtedly a domestic focus, but even though, you know, we might be kind of, we will have to have our own response, or we have to implement it domestically for sure. But I do think that we always should be thinking about how what we're doing will interface with what other regimes and other countries are doing. So, you know, climate change, sure, we might have to do some very particular things ourselves, but it's not so up in the ether that we shouldn't be thinking about whether if we do something, it might actually encourage someone else to, you know, work around our system because they're not in New Zealand, and it could still have an impact on us, or, you know, even our ability to access some of the green technology. You know, we've got to think about how what's going on in the wider world might help us to deliver on some of our domestic regulatory settings. And I also think it's also just one thing I would also want to just throw into the mix here. I think there's always a concern that if we are forced to sort of adopt or do what everyone else in the world is doing, that we might lose some of what we see as our competitive advantage. But I do think you can still think about how your regulation and how we implement it is in a New Zealand relatively light-handed and, you know, we kind of a considered way, but still works well with the kind of international direction of travel. So I'm not saying we have to become as prescriptive or burdensome as we might perceive some other regimes. So, you know, there's a romantic element. There's also often a fear that if we have to think about the international, we're going to somehow have to be some sort of behemoth with lots of rigid rules. I don't think that necessarily follows either.
No, and it's interesting because what it triggers in my head, previous actually episodes of the conversation series that we've had, is almost a trope that comes in that keeps rearing itself, is the relationship between policy and regulatory when it comes not just to the design of the rules, but how they kind of kick off in practice and that continual dialogue and design. And Julie, perhaps back to you on this point. What's your observation on that?
Well, I think that the thing which throughout my public service career I've kind of worried about is the fact that policy people and operational people don't seem to talk well to each other. And actually this issue around international, thinking about the international element of your work applies to everybody. It's about the design, but it's also about the implementation. And we kind of need to be much better at talking to each other. You know, before we start talking to our international colleagues, we should actually start talking to each other. You know, we should actually have better lines of communication because, you know, I think as we all know, that, you know, something looks great on paper in the real world and practice doesn't really work. But if we had a better dialogue, maybe we could avoid that happening. And it's the same as true. We need that feedback into the design or the thinking about which international regulatory cooperation options we might want to use. It's no point a policy boffin like me going off and to some international organization and signing us up to something that, you know, people on the ground will find impossible to actually implement. So fundamental, absolutely fundamental.
It is interesting, isn't it? And I can see the audience coming back. And I was going to ask whether, as we come to the sort of later stages, whether there are any questions. There certainly are. Many overseas innovations can be hindered by old and inflexible regulations in New Zealand. So sort of autonomous drones and cars, advances in genetic understanding. I guess when it comes to design of that kind, but also implementation, and Matt, perhaps from your take, you know, across fintech and tax to start with, and then back to Julie, how can we build in future flexibility and agility when it comes to design?
That is a real challenge. I like the example of autonomous drones and cars. That is a future that, I guess, a technology that is perhaps not quite there yet, but it's certainly on the horizon and certainly a lot closer than perhaps you would see. And you could reasonably anticipate a future that you might be taking a driverless car, a taxi as it were, to work in the future, or to the airport perhaps. And that sort of building a regulatory system that could cater to that makes a lot of sense. it's probably better to start on these things sooner rather than later too.
And I guess the other thing, I'm sorry, you first.
It's okay. I guess that is sort of where the challenge lies. It's what futures do you pick, and then what, I guess, to what extent do you look to try explore or establish a regulatory regime? Often I think it's a case of sort of discussion and collaboration between the regulator and the regulated entities. If you do think a bit about tax, think of a standard GST tax return. It's about 2 pages. Fill in some boxes and some numbers, a bit of math homework. It's not the most complicated thing. And then that simplicity is quite an important feature of GST and some of the other taxes that we have. Because you think of the average person who pays GST, odds are they're a small to medium business. Small to medium businesses do make up the bulk of the New Zealand economy. It's a lot of small shops around town, you know, the little cafes, the hairdressers, the tradesmen, the builders, the plumbers. They're all very important. And a lot of them don't go into business so they can spend their time trying to fill out tax returns. I'm sure we all appreciate it. If you can make a system, a tax system that is simple to use, easy to apply for your customer, that they can meet their obligations in a way that isn't onerous or burdensome or doesn't get in the way of them doing their own business, and I think you've sort of hit the right spot. That's a good place to be.
And I think, and thank you for that, because I mean, I think that moves it a certain way, Julie, when it's, you know, cutting through all of this, we're regulators regulating people. They want simplicity, because whether they can sort of get through the complicated stuff or not, they don't want to waste their time. You know, regulated parties doing business, international trade. One of our audience already said WTO obligations that we check in internationally to facilitate trade. The traders just want to get on with it. Simplicity is key, isn't it?
I think that is, it's kind of something that should sit across all of the ways we think about this. So it's part of the international context, but it's part of the domestic thing as well. I am conscious that, you know, small business really struggles just to kind of get its business done. So the government needs to be very conscious of the kind of how it regulates in a way that makes life as easy as possible for small business. And I think that we should be thinking about that in the international regulatory cooperation context as well. Interestingly, in terms of the future proofing, a couple of just quick comments is that there's a lot of thinking going on internationally about what's called agile regulation. It's a kind of buzzword, but it really means regulation that is more adaptable as, you know, change is happening so much faster these days. But also when you do have change, which is perhaps of the sort of more disruptive new technologies or emerging tech or whatever, actually those are the areas where maybe because they're new areas, it's really good to talk to international colleagues, so that rather than us in our little silos developing different rules, we could actually develop a common set of rules very early on, because that's, you know, the best time to do it when everybody's got a blank page. That can be a really good thing. And we can bring to the table that, you know, the lens of small, and trying to, you know, focus on being as light-handed as possible while still achieving our public policy objectives. I think that's what should be our byword, really. And
nimble, and keeping it simple, and just reflecting on that. We're up right at the top of the hour, so a big thanks to Matt and Julie, and to you, members of the. I found that absolutely fascinating. We went everywhere. And in terms of the dimension, the international and the national dimension, the domestic dimension, I simply say in the closing seconds before I close this with the Karakia, the GREG conference is coming soon, because it's there on the 23rd of November, which is a month on Sunday. All our usual channels, the website, our new website, take a look at that, and you'll be able to find that if you've looked at our newsletter, and also the current website will also take you to it. There's loads going on. There's a LinkedIn network. There are so many platforms. I actually don't have time, given I've got less than a minute left, to talk about them, but you do have a look. And I close now, as I always do, with the MB Karakia. I do so now. Ka hiki, te tapu, kia watiai, te ara, kia tarukiai, te o marama. Huie, pakiai. Well, until next time, members of the audience, and there will be a next time, stay safe, stay well. Thank you for joining us, and ka kite anu.